"Tell me, Clara," Mason said, pressing the treaty pen into the ink, "how much is a sister worth when a kingdom is starving?" The question fell across the great hall like winter glass, cold enough to cut without leaving a mark. Clara Whitmore stood 12 feet from the council table with silver cord wrapped around her wrists, her pale fingers folded so tightly that her knuckles looked almost translucent beneath the candlelight. Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows of White Oak Manor, soft and steady, as if the sky itself was trying not to interrupt the betrayal happening below. Her oldest brother did not look at her when he spoke. Mason never looked at anything he had already decided to lose. He wore their father's black coat, their father's signet ring, their father's hard expression, but none of the mercy their father had once carried in his voice. Beside him, Caleb stood with his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the floor. That hurt worse. Mason had always been made of pride. Caleb had once been made of laughter. Caleb had once carried Clara on his back across the creek behind the house when she was 8 years old and afraid of the water. He had once promised no one would ever trade her away for land, coin, or power. Now he held the enemy treaty in both hands and pretended he could not hear her breathing. "The Blackthorn Pact demands compensation," Mason said to the gathered elders, his voice smooth, practiced, almost noble. "Our borders remain intact. Our people keep their homes. Our debts are forgiven." Elder Warren, gray-haired and trembling, glanced toward Clara with something like shame. "And the tribute?" Mason's mouth tightened. "Accepted." Clara felt the word inside her chest before she understood it. Accepted. Not discussed. Not begged over. Not mourned. Accepted, like a shipment of grain or a lame horse sold before winter. The silver cord was not painful, not truly, but it was cold, and that cold seemed to travel beneath her skin until it reached every place where hope had been hiding. She looked at Caleb then, willing him to lift his head, willing him to remember anything good. "Caleb," she whispered. His throat moved. He did not answer. Mason signed first. The scratch of the pen sounded louder than thunder. Then Caleb stepped forward. His hand hovered above the page just long enough for Clara's heart to rise in one last, foolish plea. He could still stop this. He could still say no. He could still be her brother. Instead, he signed. Clara's breath left her so quietly no one heard it go. The Blackthorn envoy, a tall woman in a dark travel cloak, took the treaty and sealed it with black wax stamped in the shape of a wolf's crown. By dawn, the envoy said, "Clara Whitmore belongs to Blackthorn." A murmur moved through the room, but no one stepped forward. No one said she was a daughter of this house. No one said she had spent years tending fires, washing linens, soothing fevers, and stitching torn sleeves long after everyone else had gone to sleep. They only saw an Omega with no strong wolf, no political value, no mate, no claim. A quiet girl could be erased with ink. Clara lifted her chin before her tears could fall. If they wanted her broken, they would have to imagine it. Her voice came out soft, but it crossed the room clearly. "Did Mother know you would become this cruel?" Mason's pen stopped moving. Caleb flinched as if her words had reached the part of him he had tried to bury. For one moment, the hall was utterly still. Then Mason closed the treaty case with a sharp click. "Take her." The guards approached gently enough to pretend this was honorable. Clara walked before they could touch her. Past the table. Past the elders. Past the brothers who had chosen a border over blood. At the doorway, she turned once, not to beg, but to remember the exact shape of their silence. Beyond the manor steps, 2 black carriages waited beneath the rain, their lanterns glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere beyond the northern woods, past 20 miles of border road and fear, stood the enemy pack that children whispered about after dark. Blackthorn. The kingdom of Alpha King Adrian Blackwood. The man no one dared betray twice. The man Clara had never met. The man who, at that very hour, woke in his distant stone palace with her name caught on his breath, because for the 1000th time in his life, he had dreamed of a pale girl with bound wrists standing beneath the rain. The carriage wheels rolled away from White Oak Manor before dawn, carrying Clara through the wet country road while the only home she had ever known disappeared behind a veil of rain. She did not look back a second time. Some doors closed slowly, with apologies and trembling hands. Others closed like the treaty case in Mason's grip, sharp enough to teach the heart not to reach for them again. Clara sat alone on the rear bench, her wrists still bound in silver cord, her cloak damp at the hem, her light brown hair pinned loosely beneath a hood that no longer kept out the cold. She was 21 years old enough to understand politics, but still young enough for betrayal to feel impossible until it happened. The guards riding outside spoke in low voices, careful and distant, as if kindness toward her might be considered disloyal. Through the window, she watched the fields of white oak pass by in gray strips of mourning. Every mile carried her farther from the kitchen garden where she had grown time for Elder Warren's cough, farther from the laundry yard where she had warmed frozen hands over steaming basins, farther from the nursery rooms where frightened pups had once curled beside her because her voice made storms feel smaller. None of that had mattered at the council table. In White Oak, strength had always meant loud footsteps, raised chins, sharp commands, and wolves powerful enough to make others step aside. Clara's gift had been quieter. She could feel sorrow before a person spoke it. She could calm a nervous horse with one palm against its neck. She could sit beside the sick for hours, steady and patient, until their breathing softened. Her mother had called it grace. Mason had called it useless. After their father died and Mason inherited the house, Clara became a shadow people used without seeing. She mended Caleb's hunting coat the night before his first border patrol. She stayed awake through winter fevers while Mason attended strategy dinners. She learned which elders needed honey in their tea, which children feared the dark, which widows pretended they were not lonely. She remembered everyone. Somehow, almost no one remembered her. That was the strange cruelty of being gentle in a house built on pride. People took your warmth, then blamed you for not burning brighter. Clara pressed her bound hands into her lap and felt the tiny ridge of a silver moon charm hidden beneath her sleeve. It had belonged to her mother, a small crescent no bigger than a dime, tied to a thread because Mason had sold the chain 2 winters ago. Clara had kept the charm anyway. A foolish thing, maybe, but it was hers. Her mother's last words returned with the rhythm of the wheels. There will come a day when they mistake your softness for surrender. Do not help them believe it. Clara closed her eyes, breathing through the ache in her throat until it became something steadier. She was afraid of Blackthorn. She was afraid of Alpha King Adrian Blackwood, of the Black Flags, of the enemy border waiting somewhere beyond the pines. But beneath the fear, beneath the shame, something small and stubborn remained awake. Her brothers had sold her because they believed she had no power. By sunrise, the road would carry her toward the first person in the world who had been searching for her long before he knew her name. By the time the carriage reached the first rise beyond White Oak territory, the rain had thinned into silver mist, and Clara could finally see the manor roof far behind her, small and dark against the morning hills. She wondered if Mason had returned to father's study already, if Caleb had poured himself coffee with shaking hands, if either of them had paused long enough to feel the shape of what they had done. The answer came too quickly. Mason would call it duty. Caleb would call it necessity. Both words were neat enough to hide cowardice inside them. Clara leaned her temple against the chilled window and let memory pull her backward to the night before, when she had carried clean towels down the west corridor and heard her own name spoken through the council room door. She had stopped because Caleb sounded angry. For one impossible second, she thought he was defending her. "There has to be another offer," he had said. "She is our sister." Then Mason answered, calm as a judge. "She is an Omega with no alliance, no dowry, and no claim. Blackthorn wants a symbol of surrender." We give them one that costs us nothing." The towels had slipped in Clara's arms, but she caught them before they fell. Inside the room, Elder Warren had asked whether she had agreed. Mason had laughed once, not warmly, not cruelly, but with the tired amusement of a man discussing furniture. "Agreement is for people with leverage." Clara had pressed one hand to the wall, feeling the wood grain beneath her palm as if the house itself could hold her upright. Caleb had gone quiet after that. That silence had followed her into sleep, into dawn, into the carriage, heavier than any chain could have been. It was not Mason who had broken her heart. Mason had spent years proving that love, to him, was just another resource to manage. It was Caleb, because Caleb knew the little things. He knew she hated being alone in storms. He knew she still kept Mother's moon charm tucked under her sleeve. He knew that when Father died, Clara had cried behind the smokehouse because she did not want Mason to see weakness and punish everyone for it. Caleb knew all of that, and still he had signed. A soft knock came from the carriage wall. The Blackthorn envoy rode beside the window, her dark hood pulled low, rain beating along the edge of her cloak. "We stop in 3 miles, she said. Her voice was not unkind, which somehow made Clara feel more fragile. "You may stretch your legs before the border road." Clara nodded. "What happens after the border?" The envoy looked toward the line of pine trees ahead, where the land dipped into a long valley known for old treaties and older grudges. "You will be presented at Blackthorn Hall." Clara swallowed. "To the council?" The envoy hesitated. Just a breath. Just enough for Clara to notice. "To the king." The wheel struck a shallow rut, and the carriage rocked beneath her. Clara's hands tightened over the moon charm hidden under her sleeve. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood was not a counsel, not a rumor, not a distant warning told to children. He was real, and every mile of wet road was carrying her closer to him. Yet somewhere, deep beneath the fear, beneath the grief of being priced and traded by her own blood, Clara felt a strange pull in her chest, faint as a candle behind a closed door. It did not feel like danger. It felt like someone, far away, had just whispered her name in the dark. They stopped at the edge of the border road where the white oak pines thinned and the blackthorn forest began, and Clara understood at once why children lowered their voices when they spoke of enemy land. The trees ahead were taller, older, their trunks dark with rain, their branches woven so tightly that the morning light entered in narrow silver lines. Black banners hung from iron posts along the road, each one marked with a crowned wolf stitched in white thread. They did not flutter. They watched. Clara stepped down from the carriage carefully, her legs stiff from hours of sitting, her wrists still circled by the silver cord. The ground beneath her boots was soft with wet leaves, and the air smelled of pine, stone, and something cold enough to make her lungs ache. One of the guards offered her water without meeting her eyes. She accepted it with a quiet thank you, because even now, even here, her mother's lessons lived inside her. Cruelty did not get to decide what kind of woman she became. The Blackthorn envoy stood a few yards away, speaking with 2 riders who had come from the northern trail. Their horses were huge, black-coated, and restless, stamping at the mud as if they could sense how close the kingdom was. Clara drank slowly and listened without meaning to. "The king did not sleep again," one rider murmured. "Same dream?" asked the envoy. The man glanced toward Clara, then lowered his voice, but not enough. "A girl in the rain. Bound wrists. Pale face." He woke saying her name, but no one could understand it. Clara's fingers tightened around the tin cup. The water trembled against its rim. The envoy noticed and turned sharply, ending the conversation with a look. Clara lowered her eyes, pretending she had heard nothing, but the words had already entered her chest. "A girl in the rain. Bound wrists." It was foolish to think it meant anything. Powerful men had dreams. Lonely men had ghosts. Kings, she imagined, had both. Still, The strange pull she had felt in the carriage returned, faint and impossible, like a thread tied somewhere behind her ribs. When they began moving again, Clara was not placed back inside the carriage. The road grew too narrow for comfort, so she walked between two mounted guards while the wheels creaked behind her. No one hurried her. No one mocked her. That small dignity unsettled her more than open contempt would have. After another mile, the forest opened to a ridge, and Blackthorn Valley appeared below. Clara stopped before she could stop herself. The land stretched for miles, wild and severe, with dark evergreens climbing the hills and a river cutting through the valley like a blade of glass. At the far end stood Blackthorn Hall, not a manor like White Oak, but a fortress of grey stone and high windows, its towers rising against the cloudy sky. It looked less built than carved from the mountain itself. A bell rang somewhere in the distance, deep and slow. Clara felt it in her bones. "That is where he lives?" she asked before she could swallow the question. The envoy followed her gaze. "That is where he rules." Clara looked down at her bound hands, at the small moon charm hidden beneath her sleeve, at the rainwater clinging to her pale skin. She had imagined arriving as a prisoner, maybe as a servant, perhaps as a warning to the pack that had raised her and thrown her away. But with every step toward the fortress, the air seemed to change around her. The guards became quieter. The horses lowered their heads. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Far ahead, beyond stone walls and black banners, Alpha King Adrian Blackwood stood at a window overlooking the valley, one hand pressed against the glass. He had not been told the tribute's name. He had not seen her face. But when the bell rang, he whispered the name from his dream again, clearer than ever this time. Clara. Adrian Blackwood had learned to fear sleep long before he learned to fear enemies. In the waking world, he was the Alpha King of Blackthorn, a man with a crown of iron, a council that measured every breath, and a kingdom that bowed before his silence. But in dreams, he was only a boy standing in snow, reaching for a girl he could never quite save. She always appeared the same way, pale beneath moonlight, rain or snow tangled in her light brown hair, her wrists bound, her gray-blue eyes lifted toward him with a courage that made the dream hurt. Sometimes she stood behind a locked gate. Sometimes she waited at the edge of a forest. Sometimes he heard her voice without seeing her face, soft as a prayer carried across miles of darkness. Clara. He had awakened with that name on his tongue for years, first as a child in a cold nursery, later as a young ruler in rooms too large to feel like shelter. The royal physicians called it stress. The old seers called it a burden of bloodline. His uncle called it weakness and suggested Adrian stop chasing shadows that did not belong in a king's mind. Adrian had said nothing. He had simply drawn her face. 1 page became 10. 10 became a locked drawer full of sketches, each one shaped from memory no living person could explain. The curve of her cheek. The quiet strength in her eyes. The small crescent mark he sometimes saw near her left wrist, shining like a piece of moon caught beneath skin. At first, he thought she was a symbol. Later, he wondered if she was a warning. But on the morning the White Oak tribute crossed into Blackthorn land, the dream changed. For the first time, the girl did not stand far away. She stood at the gates of his own hall, rain on her cloak, fear in her chest, and when Adrian reached for her, she did not vanish. She looked directly at him and whispered, "I am here." He woke before sunrise with his hand closed around empty air and the sound of the border bell rolling through the stone palace. Now, hours later, he stood in his private chamber while servants moved quietly behind him, laying out a formal black coat embroidered with silver thread. Councilman Pierce waited near the door with a stack of treaty papers, his expression careful. "White Oak has sent the agreed tribute, Your Majesty," he said. "A young Omega from the Whitmore line. Their council confirms the transfer is lawful." Adrian turned from the window slowly. "Lawful is not the same as honorable." Pierce lowered his gaze. No, Your Majesty. Adrian looked past him to the small writing desk where his oldest dream journal lay open. He had not opened it in months, yet the page had fallen to a sketch made when he was 17. The girl in the drawing stood beneath rain with her wrists bound in silver. Beneath the image, written in his own younger hand, was one word. Clara. A sound moved through the corridor outside, the low murmur of guards announcing the arrival party. Adrian felt the entire palace tighten around him. He should have gone to the throne room as a king, distant and unreadable, ready to reject whatever insult White Oak had dared disguise as diplomacy. Instead, he reached for the journal and closed it with a hand that was not quite steady. For the first time in his life, the dream was walking toward him. Blackthorn Hall did not welcome Clara so much as swallow her whole. The great doors opened into a chamber of stone, firelight, and watchful silence, where black banners hung from the rafters and hundreds of eyes turned toward the girl White Oak had sent across the border. Clara kept her chin lifted, though every instinct told her to make herself smaller. The silver cord around her wrists looked painfully bright against the dark wool of her cloak, a quiet announcement that she had not arrived by choice. The envoy guided her forward along the center aisle, past warriors in formal coats, elders with silver rings, and highborn wolves who looked at her as if they were trying to decide whether she was an apology, an insult, or a prize. Someone near the pillars murmured, "That is the tribute?" Another voice answered, "White Oak must be poorer than we thought." Clara heard them. Of course she heard them. She had spent a lifetime hearing the words people tried to hide behind lowered voices. But she did not give them her eyes. She focused instead on the throne at the far end of the hall, carved from black oak and pale stone, standing beneath a window tall enough to frame the gray morning sky. It was empty. For one fragile second, Clara let herself breathe. Then every person in the room dropped to one knee. The silence changed. It deepened. It became something living. Clara turned before she meant to, and saw him enter through the side arch. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood was not dressed like the monster White Oak children had imagined in whispers. He wore no crown in that moment, only a long black coat threaded with silver at the cuffs, his dark blonde hair brushed back from a face too calm to be called kind and too controlled to be called cruel. His skin was pale beneath the firelight, his posture still, his gray eyes cold enough to quiet an entire hall without a single command. Power moved with him, not loud, not hurried, but absolute. Clara felt it brush against her like the first hard wind before snow. She lowered her gaze because everyone else had lowered theirs, because surviving had taught her the value of obedience. The envoy spoke clearly. "Your Majesty, Clara Whitmore of White Oak, delivered under the terms of surrender." Delivered. The word landed at Clara's feet like a label tied to her name. She waited for Adrian to dismiss her, question her, perhaps send her to whatever place unwanted tributes were kept until politics needed them again. Footsteps crossed the stone instead. Slow. Measured. Coming closer. Clara saw polished black boots stop in front of her. "Look at me," Adrian said. His voice was quiet, yet the command in it filled the hall. Clara lifted her head. The moment their eyes met, everything inside the room seemed to fall away. Adrian went utterly still. Not surprised in the way people reacted to beauty or fear or disappointment. This was different. This was recognition so deep it looked almost painful. The color left his face. His hand, the hand of a king who had signed laws, ended wars, and held a kingdom steady through winter, closed slowly at his side as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Clara did not understand it. She only knew that the most feared man in the Northern Territories was staring at her as though she had stepped out of a memory he had carried alone for years. A whisper moved through the council. Adrian ignored it. His gaze dropped to the silver cord around her wrists, and something colder than anger passed across his eyes. Who bound her? No one answered. The envoy bowed her head. White Oak delivered her this way. Adrian looked back at Clara, and his voice changed, softened at the edge without losing its power. Did they hurt you? The question nearly undid her. Not because it was grand. Because it was simple. Because no one at White Oak had asked it. Clara swallowed, her voice steady only because pride held it together. They signed papers. Adrian's eyes darkened with understanding. That is not what I asked. The hall held its breath. Clara looked at the king, at the stranger from enemy land, at the man who seemed less like a captor with every passing second. My brothers sold me, she said. Adrian did not move for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, reached toward the silver cord, and stopped just before touching her, waiting for permission in front of every wolf in Blackthorn Hall. Clara looked at his hand, then at his face. Slowly, she gave the smallest nod. When his fingers brushed the cord, warmth flared beneath her skin, sudden and impossible, and somewhere deep inside her, something that had slept her whole life stirred. The silver cord loosened beneath Adrian's fingers as if it had been waiting for his touch to surrender. Clara watched the knot fall open, watched the pale line it left around her wrists slowly warm beneath the air, and for one impossible heartbeat she forgot the hall, the banners, the council, even the shame of how she had arrived. His hand hovered near hers, close enough that she could feel heat where there should have been distance. He did not grab. He did not claim. He waited. That single restraint shook her more than power would have. Every person in White Oak had spoken about her as if her will had been buried before she entered the room, but the Alpha King of Blackthorn, the enemy her brothers had feared more than ruin, looked at her as if permission mattered. Clara drew her hands back against her chest, not because she feared him, but because the warmth beneath her skin had frightened her with its gentleness. Adrian saw the movement and stepped back at once. A faint murmur passed through the hall. Councilman Pierce moved forward, his face careful but tense. Your Majesty, the treaty requires formal acceptance before witnesses. Adrian did not look away from Clara. The treaty calls her tribute. Yes, Your Majesty. She is not a tribute. The words were quiet, but they struck the hall harder than a shout. Clara felt the room shift around her, hundreds of wolves trying to understand whether mercy had just become law. Pierce swallowed. Then how shall the court record her arrival? Adrian's gaze dropped again to the marks at her wrists, then lifted to her face with something almost unguarded in his eyes. As a guest under my protection until she chooses otherwise. The word guest moved through Clara like sunlight through a closed room. Not prisoner. Not payment. Not loss. Guest. She tried to speak, but her throat tightened around all the things she had trained herself not to need. Kindness was dangerous when a person had survived without it. It made the heart reach before the mind could stop it. Adrian seemed to understand that too. He turned to the nearest attendant, a young woman with auburn hair and a soft expression. Bring warm water, fresh clothes, and a meal. No one questions her. No one touches her belongings. No one repeats what was said here outside this hall. The attendant bowed. Yes, Your Majesty. Clara found her voice at last. Why? Adrian's stillness changed, just slightly. Why what? Why are you being careful with me? The question was too honest, and the hall seemed to lean toward it. Adrian looked at her as though the answer had lived in him for so long that speaking it would break something open. For a moment, Clara saw not a king, not a legend, but a man standing at the edge of an old grief. Because I know what it is to be handed a fate you did not choose, he said. It was not the whole truth. Clara felt that with a certainty she could not explain. There was something behind his eyes, something older than this morning, older than the treaty, older than the road that had carried her here. Do you know me? She asked softly. The question left her before caution could stop it. Adrian's breath changed. Just once. No, he said, and somehow the word sounded like pain. Not yet. Clara should have found that answer. Strange. Instead, it settled inside her like a door left unlocked. Pierce cleared his throat, uneasy. "Your Majesty, White Oak's representatives are expected by nightfall to receive confirmation of the exchange." Adrian's expression cooled at once. The man who had looked at Clara with careful gentleness became the ruler again, composed and unreadable. "Let them come." Clara's hands curled around the little moon charm hidden beneath her sleeve. "My brothers?" "Yes." Adrian's voice sharpened around the single word, not with rage, but with judgment held under perfect control. Clara looked toward the great doors of Blackthorn Hall, and for the first time since Mason signed the treaty, fear was not the only thing waiting inside her. Something else had begun to stir, quiet and bright, as if her own soul had heard a distant call and lifted its head. Adrian saw her touch the charm beneath her sleeve. His eyes flickered, almost as if he recognized the gesture. Then he looked away too quickly, and Clara knew. Whatever secret had made his hand tremble when he untied her cord, it had not begun today. By nightfall, Blackthorn Hall had changed its silence into ceremony. The great chamber was lit with long rows of candles, their flames trembling against polished stone while Clara stood near the side of the throne in a clean blue dress the attendants had given her, soft wool instead of travel-stained cloth, warm sleeves covering the faint marks the silver cord had left behind. She should have felt safer without the bindings, but safety was a language she had not yet learned to trust. Every time the great doors opened, her heart answered before her mind did. Adrian stood a few feet away, not on the throne, but beside it, as if he refused to place distance between himself and the truth that was coming. He had spoken little since afternoon. Once, when an attendant brought Clara tea, he had quietly asked whether the honey was too strong. That small concern had stayed with her longer than it should have. Then the doors opened, and the past walked in wearing white oak colors. Mason entered first, tall, composed, his coat brushed clean, his expression arranged into courtly respect. Caleb followed half a step behind him, paler than Clara remembered, his eyes finding her at once and then dropping away. Behind them came two white oak witnesses carrying a locked box, the promised payment records waiting to be confirmed. Mason bowed to Adrian with perfect form. "Your Majesty, White Oak honors the treaty and awaits confirmation of acceptance." Adrian's face gave nothing away. "You came for your reward." Mason smiled as if the word did not shame him. "We came to complete lawful terms." Clara felt the old cold rise in her chest. Caleb looked at her then, really looked, and something like regret crossed his face. It came too late to be useful. Mason glanced toward her dress, her unbound hands, her place beside the throne, and irritation flickered through his mask. "I see she has been treated generously." Clara was always good at drawing pity. The hall went still. Clara did not lower her head. She had spent all day remembering what it felt like to breathe without asking permission. Adrian turned his gaze to Mason. "Say that again." Mason hesitated, finally sensing the edge beneath the quiet. "I meant no offense. She is a harmless girl, Your Majesty. A soft omega. She has no real value beyond what the treaty required." Caleb whispered, "Mason." Adrian lifted one hand, and Councilman Pierce stepped forward carrying a dark leather journal. Clara recognized the way Adrian's eyes changed when he saw it. Not embarrassment. Not fear. Reverence, almost. Pierce placed the journal in Adrian's hand. The king opened it slowly, then turned it outward for the hall to see. On the page was a drawing of Clara. Not a resemblance. Not an imagined face that happened to be close. It was her, younger somehow and yet exactly the same, standing beneath rain with her light brown hair loose around her shoulders and a crescent moon charm near her wrist. A sound moved through the court like wind through trees. Clara stared until the candles blurred. Beneath the sketch was a date from 15 years earlier. She would have been 6. Adrian would have been a boy. Mason's face lost color. "What is this?" Adrian's voice remained calm, but the calm had become judgment. Proof that the moon knew her before you decided she was disposable. Clara's hand went to the charm beneath her sleeve. Adrian saw it and turned the page. More drawings. The same eyes. The same rain. The same bound wrists. Years of them. A life of searching recorded in ink. Caleb took one unsteady step back. You dreamed of her. Adrian closed the journal gently. Every year. Every winter. Every time my kingdom told me to forget a girl no one believed was real. He looked at Clara then, and all the power in the room softened around her name. But she was real. For the first time, Clara did not feel like the girl sold to settle a debt. She felt seen so completely that even her sorrow had nowhere left to hide. Mason opened his mouth, but no polished answer came. Adrian turned back to him. You did not bring me tribute. You brought me the person my soul has been walking toward all my life. For a long moment, no one in Blackthorn Hall moved. Mason stood beneath the candlelight with all his practiced certainty stripped from his face, while Caleb stared at the closed journal as if it had become a mirror he could no longer avoid. Clara felt the room around her, the stone beneath her shoes, the warmth of the blue wool at her wrists, the quiet weight of hundreds of witnesses seeing what her own family had refused to see. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The treaty is void, he said. Mason blinked, shaken back into motion. Your Majesty, White Oak fulfilled the requested terms. White Oak attempted to trade a person as property and call it peace. Adrian turned to Councilman Pierce. Record this clearly. Blackthorn will not honor any agreement made through coercion, concealment, or the sale of kin. Pierce bowed. Recorded, Your Majesty. Mason stepped forward too quickly, then stopped when the nearest guards shifted. They did not threaten him. They simply reminded him whose hall he stood in. This is a misunderstanding, Mason said, his voice losing its polish. Clara agreed for the sake of her pack. Clara looked at him then. She expected fear. She expected grief. Instead, a calm she had never known settled over her like dawn spreading across frost. No, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it reached every corner of the hall. You signed before you asked me. You called me a cost. You told them I had no value. Mason's mouth tightened. You do not understand what leadership requires. Caleb closed his eyes, and Clara knew he remembered the council room too. Adrian stepped down from the dais, not toward Mason, but toward Clara. When he reached her, he removed the royal cloak from his shoulders, black on the outside, silver lined within, and held it open. He did not drape it over her like a claim. He waited, just as he had waited before touching the silver cord. Clara looked at the cloak, then at the man who had dreamed of her before either of them understood why. In his eyes, she found no demand. Only recognition. Only a question. Slowly, Clara stepped forward. Adrian settled the cloak around her shoulders, and warmth gathered there as if the fabric had been waiting for her. A breath passed through the hall. Not shock this time. Reverence. Adrian turned to Mason and Caleb with Clara standing beside him, not behind him. You brought her here as tribute, he said. Blackthorn receives her as a protected guest, honored by the crown, free to choose her own future. Mason's face hardened with desperation. And White Oak? Adrian's answer was measured. White Oak will receive aid for its people, because innocent families should not suffer for the pride of those who lead them. But the Whitmore brothers will hold no authority over her again. Their petition for land, gold, and political favor is denied. Caleb's shoulders sank as if the sentence had touched something heavier than punishment. Clara, he whispered. She looked at him, at the brother who had once carried her across a creek and later let her walk alone into enemy land. I hope one day you become brave enough to regret this honestly, she said. Caleb bowed his head. Mason said nothing. There was nothing left for him to buy with words. Adrian faced the court, and the candles seemed to burn steadier as he spoke. Let every pack hear this. A gentle soul is not a weak one. A woman betrayed by her blood is not without family. And no treaty in my kingdom will ever be stronger than her right to choose. Clara's eyes stung, but she did not hide from the tears this time. They did not feel like defeat. They felt like the first rain after a long drought. Then Adrian turned toward her, lowered himself to one knee before the entire hall, and offered his open hand. Gasps rose around them, but Clara heard only the quiet beat inside her chest. They sold you to my kingdom, he said softly. But the moon sent you to my soul. Stay only if you wish to stay. Leave if freedom asks it of you. Either way, Clara Whitmore, you will never be treated as nothing again. Clara looked at his hand. The moon charm beneath her sleeve warmed until it glowed faintly through the fabric. Somewhere deep inside her, the sleeping part of herself opened its eyes at last, not with fear, but with recognition. She placed her hand in Adrian's, and the hall filled with silver light.